Picture a man sitting alone on the steps of the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus. He is watching children play a game in the dust. He does not join them. He does not speak to the priests passing behind him. He has written something down. One book. Ancient tradition remembers that he placed it in the temple, so that only the serious would find it. He believed most people would not understand it. He was probably right. His name is Heraclitus. He lived 25 centuries ago and left behind fewer than 150 sentences. Those sentences have never stopped arguing with us. Settle in. Let the night go quiet. We are going to Ephesus. Chapter 1. The Man Who Refused. There is a kind of person who is born into everything the world considers desirable and walks away from it anyway. Not out of confusion, not out of failure, out of a clear-eyed decision that what the world is offering is simply not worth the price of becoming the kind of person who accepts it. Heraclitus of Ephesus was that kind of person. He was born sometime in the latter half of the 6th century BCE, in the city of Ephesus, on the western coast of what is now Turkey. Scholars generally place his birth somewhere around 535 BCE, though the exact date remains uncertain, as it does for most figures of his era. Ephesus was not a provincial backwater. It was one of the great cities of the Greek-speaking world, a busy trading port where Persian influence met Greek culture, where money moved and ideas travelled and ambitious men built careers that the rest of the Mediterranean noticed. Heraclitus was born into the ruling family of that city. His family held a hereditary title, the Basileus, a kind of priest-king role connected to the religious ceremonies of Ephesus. It was a position of genuine honour, the kind that came with social standing, public visibility, and the expectation that you would take it seriously and pass it on. He gave it to his brother. The ancient sources that record this, and we should be honest that those sources come to us centuries after his life, present the act as a deliberate renunciation rather than an accident of circumstance. Heraclitus did not lose the title. He did not have it taken from him by the tradition that history preserved. He simply decided he had no use for it and passed it along. What he wanted instead was to think. This is not as simple as it sounds. In the world Heraclitus inhabited, the life of the mind was not a recognized profession. There were no universities. There were no philosophy departments. There were no fellowships or grants or institutions organized around supporting a person who wanted to spend their days working out how the universe actually functioned. The men who did this kind of thinking in the Greek world of the 6th and 5th centuries BCE were unusual figures, often misunderstood, frequently mocked, occasionally celebrated only after they had died and could no longer object to the celebration. Heraclitus seems to have understood this from the beginning, and his response was not to seek a more welcoming audience. His response was something closer to a principled withdrawal, backed by a contempt that was not subtle and not performed. He wrote, in the fragments that survive, that most people do not understand the Logos, the underlying rational principle of reality, even after they have heard it explained. He compared the majority of human beings to people who are asleep, moving through the world without ever waking up to what the world actually is. He said that learning many things does not teach understanding. He named specific targets. He said that Pythagoras had practiced inquiry more than anyone, and that it had produced, in his view, what he called a fraudulent wisdom rather than genuine understanding. He said that Homer deserved to be thrown out of the competitions and beaten with a stick. This was not the language of a man seeking followers. The ancient biographical tradition, preserved most fully by Diogenes Laertius, writing in the 3rd century of the Common Era, describes Heraclitus as solitary and given to expressing his low opinion of his fellow citizens with a directness they found uncomfortable. He reportedly refused an invitation from the Persian king Darius, who had written asking Heraclitus to come to the Persian court and share his wisdom. The letter Heraclitus supposedly sent back declined on the grounds that he had no interest in Persian wealth and was perfectly content with whatever he could find, while his capacity for thought remained intact. We should be careful here. Diogenes Laertius was writing roughly 700 years after Heraclitus lived, and the biographical details he preserves mix verifiable fragment evidence with stories that had accumulated over centuries. The letter to Darius may be a later invention. The specific details of Heraclitus's daily life are largely beyond what the historical record can confirm. What we can say is this: the fragments themselves, the actual surviving words attributed to Heraclitus, are consistent with a personality that had no patience for performance, no interest in popularity, and no desire to make his ideas easier than they were for an audience that had not done the work to deserve the easier version. Whatever the biographical details, the philosophy reflects a man who had decided that clarity was more important than comfort, and that most people would choose comfort. He lived in Ephesus his entire life. As far as the record shows, he did not travel to Athens. He did not establish a school. He did not gather students in the formal way that later philosophers would. He wrote one book. Ancient sources suggest it was written in a compressed and demanding style, structured so that the reader had to work to find the meaning. Some ancient commentators thought the difficulty was a pose, a way of seeming profound without actually being profound. Plato and Aristotle, who came later and disagreed with each other about nearly everything, both engaged with Heraclitus seriously enough to argue against him at length. You do not spend that kind of effort arguing against someone whose difficulty is merely a performance. The difficulty was real, and the reason for it, if we take Heraclitus at his word in the fragments, was not arrogance in the ordinary sense. It was something more interesting. He believed that the truth about reality was genuinely difficult, that it did not yield to casual attention, that the Logos was present everywhere and available to anyone willing to look with sufficient seriousness, but that most people would never look with sufficient seriousness because looking that carefully was uncomfortable in ways that daily life gave them every reason to avoid. He was not making the work hard in order to exclude people. He was refusing to pretend the work was easier than it was. There is a difference. It is worth sitting with. The children playing in the dust outside the temple, the merchants moving through the market, the politicians arguing in the assembly, all of them were, in Heraclitus's view, moving through a world governed by a pattern they were not seeing, not because the pattern was hidden, because they were not looking. He had looked. He had spent his life looking, and what he found, he put into a book that he left in a temple, written in sentences that required the same quality of attention that he believed the world itself required. He did not make it easy. The world is not easy. He saw no reason to pretend otherwise. That is the man we are spending the night with. Not a comforting figure, not a warm one, but an honest one in a way that very few people across 25 centuries have managed to sustain, from the first sentence to the last. The question he spent his life with begins simply enough. What is the world actually made of? Underneath everything we think we see, his answer was not what anyone expected, and it started with a river. Chapter 2. The River. There is a sentence so famous that most people who quote it have never read anything else Heraclitus wrote. They encountered it in a classroom, or in a book about change, or on the kind of poster that puts ancient wisdom next to a photograph of moving water. They nodded. They moved on. You cannot step into the same river twice. It sounds like a poet's observation, something gentle and melancholy about time passing, about the way things change, whether we want them to or not. It sounds like something you might say at a reunion, or on the last day of something you loved. That reading is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that matters, because Heraclitus was not writing poetry, and he was not making an observation about nostalgia. He was making a claim about the structure of reality, and the full claim is considerably stranger and more demanding than the famous sentence alone suggests. The fragment, as scholars have reconstructed it from ancient sources, goes further than most people know. It is not simply that the river changes. It is that you change too. You cannot step into the same river twice, because it is not the same river, and you are not the same person. Both the river and the person stepping into it are caught in the same process of constant transformation. Neither one holds still long enough to be fixed. Stop here for a moment. Because this is where the philosophy begins to press against something genuinely uncomfortable. We move through our days with the working assumption that we are the same person we were yesterday, that the coffee cup on the table is the same cup it was this morning, that the city we live in is continuous with the city we grew up in. These assumptions are not just habits of thought. They are the foundation on which we build everything. Memory, identity, relationships, law, meaning itself. We need things to stay the same, or at least similar enough that we can orient ourselves. Heraclitus is telling you that this need, however understandable, does not change what is actually happening. The river looks like a river. It has a name. It has banks. It occupies a recognizable place in the landscape. But every moment, the water that constitutes it is different water. The riverbed shifts. The temperature changes. The organisms living in it are born and die and are replaced. The river is not a thing. It is a process. It is change that has taken on the appearance of stability, and it does so well enough that we give it a name and treat it as a fixed object. And we are doing the same thing. The cells of your body are replaced over periods ranging from days to years, depending on the tissue. The thoughts you are having tonight are not the thoughts you had last night. Even if the subject is similar, the person you were at 20 and the person you are now share a name and a continuous memory, but the continuity is a story you tell about a process, not a fixed object that has persisted unchanged through time. Heraclitus saw this. He saw it in the 6th century BCE. Without microscopes, without cellular biology, without the physics of continuous change that modern science would eventually develop. He saw it by watching rivers. Now here is the part that the poster never tells you. He refused to explain what he meant. Not because he did not know. The fragments make clear that he had thought through the implications more carefully than almost anyone who came after him. He refused because he believed that the explanation was something each person had to arrive at themselves, through their own sustained attention to the world. Handing someone a conclusion without the thinking that produced it was, in his view, not education. It was the thing that kept people asleep. The ancient sources record that Socrates, after reading Heraclitus, said that what he could understand was excellent, and that he suspected what he could not understand was excellent too, but that it would take a diver to get to the bottom of it. We should be honest that this anecdote comes to us through tradition rather than direct documentation, and that the exact wording varies across sources. But the image it preserves is accurate to something real about the experience of reading Heraclitus. You have to go down to find what is there. The meaning does not float on the surface. This was deliberate, and it connects to something that the river fragment alone does not fully reveal. Heraclitus was not just making a point about change. He was making a point about attention. The river changes whether you notice or not. The question is whether you are the kind of person who notices, whether you have developed the quality of awareness that can see what is actually happening, rather than what habit and convenience have trained you to expect. Most people, he believed, had not. Most people stepped into the river, felt the water, formed a general impression, and moved on, having learned nothing about what the river actually was or what their own experience of it actually meant. He had no patience for this, but he had no interest in simply telling people the answer either. The answer, without the attention that produced it, was worthless. It would be filed away with all the other facts that people carry around without understanding, nodded at when convenient, forgotten when not. The river keeps moving. Heraclitus kept writing, and what he wrote next moved from water to something far more volatile, because, for Heraclitus, the best image of what reality actually was not a river at all. It was fire. Chapter 3. Fire. Fire is the wrong image if you want comfort. It consumes. It transforms whatever it touches into something unrecognizable. It does not hold still. It cannot be contained without eventually going out. It is simultaneously the most alive thing you can watch, and the thing most committed to destroying the form of whatever it encounters. Heraclitus chose it deliberately. The thinkers who came before him had been searching for what they called the ark, the primary substance from which everything else was made. Thales of Miletus, whom ancient tradition called the first philosopher, had proposed water. Anaximenes had proposed air. Anaximander had proposed something he called the boundless, an indefinite substrate that could not be identified with any particular material. These were serious proposals made by serious thinkers, and they represented something genuinely new in human thought. The attempt to explain the world not through the stories of gods and myths, but through the properties of the world itself. Heraclitus knew this tradition, and he proposed fire. But there is something important to understand about what he meant, and getting it wrong leads to a misreading of his entire philosophy. He was not simply saying that fire is the basic building block of matter, the way a modern chemist might say that hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe. He was saying something more structural than that. Fire, for Heraclitus, was the best available image of how reality actually worked, not just what it was made of. Fire is a process. It exists only in the act of transformation. A flame burning on a piece of wood is not a thing. It is the event of wood becoming heat and light and ash. Stop the process, and there is no flame. The flame is the process. This is what Heraclitus meant when he said that all things are an exchange for fire, and fire for all things. As goods are exchanged for gold, and gold for goods, the comparison to economic exchange is precise, not decorative. In an exchange, value moves. No single thing holds it permanently. The gold becomes goods, and the goods become gold. And the system lives in the movement between them, not in the possession of any fixed point. Reality, for Heraclitus, works the same way. Everything is in the process of becoming something else. What was wood becomes heat. What was heat becomes the warmth that keeps someone alive through winter. What was the living thing eventually becomes the material from which other living things grow. And the fire does not destroy. It moves value through forms. He also connected fire to something he called the Logos. The Logos is the most contested term in the Heraclitean fragments, and honest treatment requires acknowledging that scholars have argued about its precise meaning for centuries without arriving at a consensus. The word itself in Greek carried several possible meanings, including word, reason, account, and proportion. In the context of Heraclitus, most careful readings treat it as something like the rational principle or the governing pattern that underlies and organizes the constant change of reality. He wrote that the Logos is common to all, but most people live as if they had their own private understanding. There is a pattern. It is available to everyone. Paying attention to the world with sufficient seriousness will reveal it. But most people substitute their own preferences and habits and inherited assumptions for the actual pattern, and then wonder why the world keeps surprising them. The fire and the Logos connect in this way. Fire, as a physical image, shows you the process of constant transformation. The Logos, as a conceptual principle, tells you that the transformation is not random, it is governed. It follows a structure that reason can apprehend. If reason is patient enough and honest enough to look at what is actually there rather than what it wants to find. This was a significant claim in the context of the 6th century BCE. The dominant framework for understanding reality was mythological. Events happened because gods willed them. The order of the world was the expression of divine personality rather than impersonal principle. Heraclitus was not straightforwardly denying the existence of the divine. Some of his fragments speak of the divine in ways that are genuinely complex and that later interpreters have read in very different ways. But one reading of the fragments suggests he was insisting that the world had a structure accessible through careful attention, not just through ceremony and ritual. The priests performing their rites in the temple behind him were, in his view, potentially missing something about the very divine they were honouring, looking at the surface of things rather than attending to the pattern beneath. He did not adjust his tone for the religious establishment. He never adjusted his tone for anyone. What he was building, across the fragments about fire and the Logos, was a picture of reality as a system of dynamic balance, not a static equilibrium, where everything holds still in its proper place, but a tension between opposing forces that produces the motion and transformation we observe everywhere we look. The river is always changing and always a river. The fire always consumes and is always fire. The world is always in flux and is always governed by the same Logos. The change and the order are not opposites. They are the same thing, seen from different angles. And this idea that opposing forces are not simply at war, but are the actual source of the order they seem to threaten, was perhaps the most original contribution Heraclitus made to human thought. He developed it with a thoroughness that the next chapter will have to follow, into territory that feels, even now, genuinely strange. Because once you accept that fire is not destruction, but transformation, the next question becomes unavoidable. What does that mean for the things we think of as opposites? Day and night, life and death, good and evil, waking and sleeping. Heraclitus had answers. They were not easy answers, but they were honest ones. And in a world that prefers easy answers, that quality alone has kept him worth reading for 25 centuries. Chapter 4. The Opposites. Start with something simple. Think about the word cold. You know what cold means. You have felt it. You have pulled a blanket tighter against it, turned up a thermostat because of it, complained about it on a morning when you did not want to leave a warm bed. Cold is one of the most immediate and unambiguous experiences available to a human body. Now, ask yourself this. Would you know what cold was if you had never felt warm? Not just intellectually, not just as a word you had been taught. Would cold mean anything to you? Feel like anything? Register as anything at all, if there were no warmth to measure it against? Heraclitus saw this, and he saw that it was not just true of temperature. He wrote that the road up and the road down are one and the same. He wrote that the sea is the purest and most polluted water, drinkable and life-giving for fish, undrinkable and deadly for human beings. He wrote that disease makes health pleasant and good, that hunger makes fullness pleasant, that weariness makes rest pleasant. He wrote that day and night are one, that life and death are one. He was not saying that these things are identical. He was not saying there is no difference between being healthy and being sick, between being alive and being dead. The differences are real. They matter. His point was more precise than a simple erasure of distinctions. His point was that each member of these pairs requires the other in order to exist at all. They do not simply coexist. They define each other. They generate each other. The tension between them is not a problem to be solved. It is the source of the reality of both. The bow is the image he used directly. A bow works because of the tension between the string pulling inward and the wood pulling outward. Release either tension and you no longer have a bow. You have a curved piece of wood and a piece of string lying on the ground. Useless separately, powerful only in their opposition. The bow exists in the tension. The tension is not a flaw in the bow. It is what the bow is. He applied this to everything. Justice requires injustice to be intelligible. We would have no concept of what is right if there were no wrong to distinguish it from. Not just no concept, no motivation, no urgency. The desire to build a just society is generated by the experience of injustice. Remove the opposition, and you remove the energy that produces the striving. War, he wrote, is the father of all things and the king of all. This is probably the fragment that has made the most readers the most uncomfortable across the centuries. It sounds like a celebration of violence. It sounds like the philosophy of someone who has decided that conflict is not just inevitable but desirable. That reading misses what he was doing. he was not saying that war is good in the moral sense. He was saying that conflict, understood as the tension between opposing forces, is the generative principle of reality. It is what produces the world rather than static emptiness. The tension between heat and cold produces weather. The tension between land and sea produces the conditions for life. The tension between what we are and what we want to become produces the motion of a human life. If everything simply agreed with everything else, if all opposing forces resolved into comfortable consensus, the result would not be harmony, it would be stasis, and stasis, for Heraclitus, was the closest thing to non-existence that the physical world could achieve. Now here is where his thought presses against something that has not aged at all. We spend enormous energy trying to eliminate tension from our lives. We seek comfort, resolution, the smoothing out of conflict into agreement. We want our inner lives to be at peace, our relationships free of friction, our societies to move past their divisions into some condition of settled harmony. These are understandable desires. They are also, in Heraclitus's view, desires that misunderstand what a life is. A life without tension is not a peaceful life. It is a life that has stopped. The friction you feel between what you are and what you want to be is not an obstacle to living well. It is the condition of living at all. The relationships that have some genuine opposition in them, where two people who see things differently maintain their differences while still holding together, are not failing to achieve harmony. They are achieving something more valuable. They are achieving the productive tension that the bow needs to function. Think about the people in your life who have shaped you most significantly, the ones who made you grow. Were they the ones who agreed with you about everything? Or were they the ones who pushed against something in you, who saw differently, who forced you to articulate what you actually believed and why? Heraclitus would not be surprised by your answer. There is one pair of opposites that he returned to with more persistence than any other. One tension that he found both the most fundamental and the most personally urgent to the question of how a human being should move through the world. The tension between sleeping and waking. He was not speaking only metaphorically when he wrote about it, but he was not speaking only literally either. And understanding what he meant requires spending some time in the strange middle territory where his philosophy of cosmic flux meets the specific experience of the person lying in the dark. Eyes beginning to close. Awareness starting its nightly retreat from the world, which is, as it happens, exactly where you are right now. Chapter 5. The Sleeping and the Waking. Let your eyes close if they want to. What is happening as they do is something Heraclitus thought about more carefully than almost anyone in the ancient world, and what he concluded is strange enough and true enough that it is worth carrying with you into whatever kind of rest tonight brings. He wrote that those who are awake have one world in common, but that those who are asleep each turn aside into their own private world. He wrote that the waking have one logos, one shared rational order, but that sleep closes off access to it, and the sleeper retreats into something smaller and more private than the world actually is. This sounds, at first, like a straightforward argument for staying awake, but Heraclitus was not simple enough for that reading. He also wrote that the logos is common to all, and yet most people live as though they had their own private understanding, even while awake. He wrote that most human beings moving through the world in full daylight, with their eyes open and their bodies functioning, are no more genuinely awake than the sleeper turning through dreams in a dark room. They are present to the surface of things without being present to what the things actually are. This is the distinction that matters to him, not the biological line between sleeping and waking, the philosophical line between genuine attention and its absence. Think about the last hour of your day before you came to rest tonight. How much of it were you actually present for? Not present in the sense of being physically located in a room, moving through tasks, generating words and responses. Present in the sense that Heraclitus meant, genuinely attending to the logos that runs through everything you are experiencing, seeing the pattern beneath the surface of the ordinary. If you are honest with yourself, and Heraclitus would not accept anything less. The answer is probably that genuine attention occupied a smaller fraction of your waking hours than you would prefer to believe. Most of what we call waking life is conducted in a state that is not exactly sleep, but is not exactly the kind of awareness Heraclitus meant either. It is the middle condition, the autopilot, the place where habit and routine and the comfortable repetition of familiar patterns carries us through the day without requiring us to actually encounter what the day is. He saw this as the central problem of human existence. Not suffering, not mortality, not the fact that the world is hard. The central problem was that most people were not actually meeting the world they were living in. They were meeting their idea of it, their habit of it, the story they had already decided it was before they walked into the room. And then they went to sleep, and the private world of their dreams replaced even that impoverished version of reality. And in the morning they woke up and did it again. The river kept changing. They kept calling it the same river. But here is where Heraclitus becomes genuinely surprising, and where his thought, if you follow it carefully enough, becomes something that feels less like philosophy and more like an unexpected permission. He did not think sleep was simply the enemy of understanding. His fragments about the unity of opposites apply here too. The logos persists through sleep. It persists through everything. The world does not stop being organized by its underlying structure just because your access to that structure is temporarily suspended. The fire does not stop transforming just because you have closed your eyes. What sleep does, in the Heraclitean picture, is remind you of something that the busy surface of waking life tends to conceal, that your individual perspective, however vivid and compelling it feels from the inside, is a small and temporary window onto something vastly larger than itself. The private world of dreams is not a punishment or a failure. It is a demonstration. It shows you, every night, that consciousness can withdraw from the shared logos and still persist, that you are not identical with your waking awareness, that there is something in you that moves through states without being captured by any of them. The person falling asleep is not disappearing. They are making a transition between modes of being that the logos encompasses equally. He wrote that immortal things are mortal and mortal things are immortal, each living the other's death and dying the other's life. The rhythm of sleep and waking is that exchange, lived out every night in every human body that has ever existed. You die a small death each time you cross into sleep. You are reborn a small birth each time you return. Neither the death nor the birth is final. Both are part of the motion that Heraclitus saw in the fire and the river and the tension of the bow. There is something else here, something quieter than philosophy and closer to what the body already knows. In the hours between waking and sleep, in the soft border territory where the day begins to release its grip and the mind starts to drift, the ordinary defences come down. The stories we tell about ourselves become less insistent. The certainties we carry through daylight hours loosen their hold. The noise of the day, the unfinished conversations, the things left undone, all of it begins to soften at the edges. What remains in that softening is something closer to what Heraclitus was pointing at than almost anything available to us in the middle of a busy day. Not the logos as an abstract principle, the logos as a felt quality, sense, brief and quiet, that the world is larger than your version of it, and that this is not a threat but a relief. The logos does not need you to be alert, to be present. It does not require your participation to continue operating. It was there before you were born. It will be there after you are gone. What you can do, in the moments when your grip on your own version of the world relaxes slightly, is catch a glimpse of something that was always there and that you were, for most of the day, too occupied to notice. That is not nothing. That is, in Heraclitean terms, one of the more valuable things a human being can do with the hours the day gives back. The logos does not sleep. The fire does not go out. The river does not stop. You, for a few hours, step back from the bank, and the river moves on, as it always has, as it always will, governed by the same pattern that was there before you arrived and will be there when you return in the morning, changed, and the same, the way the river is always changed, and the same, the way you are always changed, and the same. Let that carry you wherever tonight is taking you. The next chapter is the one that requires the most honesty to receive well. It is the part where Heraclitus tells you, directly and without softening, what he thought of most people and why. But before you decide how to feel about that, hold on to this. The man who thought poorly of most people also believed, without any contradiction, that every single one of them had access to the same logos he did. He was not writing them off. He was furious at the waste. That distinction is everything. We will look at it closely next. For now, rest. The river is still moving. You do not need to watch it every moment to know that it is there. Chapter 6. What he thought of you. The question is not whether his contempt was pleasant. It was not. The question is whether it was aimed at human weakness or human waste. That distinction is everything, and it is the distinction that most people who have heard of Heraclitus have never been given the chance to consider. So let us consider it carefully. He wrote that most people are bad, and few are good. He wrote that one person is worth 10,000 to him. If that person is excellent, he wrote that the majority of human beings have no more understanding of the Logos than dogs have of what they cannot smell. He wrote that eyes and ears are poor witnesses for people who have barbarian souls, by which he meant people who encounter information without the capacity to process what it actually means. He did not soften any of this. He did not add qualifications about how he was sure his readers were the exception. He wrote it plainly. In a book he left in a temple, and if you were offended by it, that was, from his perspective, probably useful information about which category you belong to. Now, before we spend this chapter simply cataloguing the ways Heraclitus was difficult, which would be easy and not particularly useful, let us ask what he was actually criticizing. Because if you read the fragments carefully, rather than reacting to their tone, what emerges is not random misanthropy. It is a very specific diagnosis of a very specific failure, and the failure he is describing is one worth taking seriously, even if you find his manner genuinely hard to sit with. The failure is this: most people, in Heraclitus's observation, organize their understanding of the world around their own preferences rather than around the actual structure of the world. They encounter the logos, the governing pattern of reality that is present in everything they see and hear and experience, and instead of attending to it, they filter it through what they already believe, what they have been taught to believe, what it would be convenient to believe, and what the people around them have agreed to believe together. He called this living as if each person had their own private logos. The logos is common. It is the same for everyone. The world runs on the same principles, regardless of your opinion about what those principles are. But most people act as though their individual understanding is a perfectly adequate substitute for genuine attention to what is actually there. Think about the last time you changed your mind about something important. Not a preference, not a taste, but something you had been genuinely certain about. How long had the evidence been there before you actually let it in? How long had you been filtering it through what you already believed, finding reasons to file it away rather than follow it where it was pointing? That gap between what the world is showing you and what you are willing to see is the gap Heraclitus was writing about. He did not find it amusing. He did not find it inevitable. He found it wasteful, in the way that a person finds it wasteful when they watch someone with every advantage choose the smaller life anyway. This is not stupidity in the ordinary sense. Heraclitus was not saying that most people are unintelligent. Some of his sharpest criticism is aimed at people who were considered extremely intelligent by the standards of his time. Pythagoras had pursued inquiry more extensively than almost anyone in the ancient Greek world, and had built from it an elaborate philosophical and religious system that his followers treated as revelation. In Heraclitus's view, he was a man who had mistaken accumulation for understanding, who had collected facts and ideas the way some people collect possessions, as a way of feeling rich, without doing the harder work of knowing what the possessions actually meant. He wrote that much learning does not teach wisdom. This is still one of the most precise sentences in the history of philosophy, and it has not become less true in 25 centuries. There is a version of education available in every era that is very good at producing people who know a great many things, and very bad at producing people who understand what those things mean, how they connect to each other, or what they require of the person who knows them. Heraclitus saw this version operating all around him, being celebrated and rewarded, and he found it to be one of the primary obstacles to the genuine understanding he was trying to point toward. Here is where the contempt becomes something more complicated than it first appeared. If Heraclitus genuinely believed that most people were incapable of understanding, the reasonable response would be silence. Why write a book at all? Why frame the Logos as something common to all, available to everyone, the shared property of every human being who has ever existed? Why express frustration at people who are not attending to what is there, if you believe they are constitutionally unable to attend? You only get frustrated at people for not doing something if you believe they could do it and are choosing not to. The contempt in Heraclitus is not the contempt of someone who has written off humanity as irredeemable. It is the contempt of someone who believes humanity is capable of something much better than what it is currently settling for, and who finds the settling, rather than the incapacity, to be the actual problem. He was not writing them off. He was furious at the waste. He left the book in the temple. He wrote it in language that required effort. He aimed it not at people who would agree with him, but at people who were willing to do the work of disagreeing carefully, which is the only way to get from disagreement to understanding. He was not trying to comfort you. He was trying to wake you up. Whether you find that more admirable or more irritating probably depends on which fragment you read first and what kind of day you had before you came to rest tonight. Both responses are understandable. Only one of them is useful. He also cared about something larger than the individual. He cared about the city, not in the way that a politician cares about the city, as a constituency to be managed, and not in the way that a patriot cares about the city, as an identity to be defended. He cared about it in the way that a person who has thought carefully about what human beings actually are and what they actually need cares about the conditions under which those needs can be met. And what he saw happening in the political life of his era made his view of most people even darker, because the same failures of attention he observed in individuals, he observed operating at the scale of entire communities, with consequences that went far beyond any individual life. That is where we are going next. Chapter 7. The City and the Law. This is the chapter that surprises people. When most readers encounter Heraclitus for the first time, they encounter the river, or the fire, or the fragments about opposites. They form an image of a solitary cosmic thinker whose attention was fixed on the structure of the universe rather than on the practical question of how human beings should organize themselves together. That image is not entirely wrong, but it leaves out one of the most interesting dimensions of his thought. He wrote that the people should fight for their law as they fight for their city wall. This single sentence is worth pausing on, because it comes from the same man who had given away his political title, who had refused the invitation of a king, who had retreated from public life into his own demanding solitude. And yet, here he is, insisting that the law matters enough to die for. The wall protects the body of the city. The law protects its soul. Lose the wall, and you lose the physical space. Lose the law, and you lose the thing that made the space worth having. The Logos is the rational principle governing the universe. Human law, at its best, is the attempt to build that same rational principle into the structure of the community. It is the shared order made visible and enforceable, the thing that makes a collection of individuals into something that can persist and function over time. A law that reflects the common Logos applies to everyone equally, persists beyond the lifetimes of the individuals who created it, and can be examined, questioned, and tested against the actual structure of the world. By that standard, most of the laws he observed around him did not do well. The ancient tradition records that the Ephesians had exiled a man named Hermodorus, described as the most capable person among them. The reason given was essentially that the Ephesians did not want anyone to be too excellent among them. Heraclitus responded with language that left no room for ambiguity. He wrote that the Ephesians deserved to have every adult among them driven out, for exiling the best man they had, We should note that translations of this fragment vary in their precise wording, and some render the language more strongly still. But the core meaning across all versions is consistent. A community that removes its best people to make the mediocre more comfortable is not protecting its wall. It is undermining it from within. He also wrote that all human laws are nourished by one divine law. The divine law here is the Logos. The claim is that human law, when it is functioning as it should, is an expression of the same rational principle that governs the fire and the river and the tension of the bow. A community that holds itself to the right standard and falls short is building something real, however imperfectly. A community that abandons the standard entirely, that stops asking whether its arrangements reflect the common Logos or merely the preferences of the powerful, is not just falling short of the ideal, it is erasing the foundation on which the ideal could ever be built. He said what he believed the city needed to hear. He did not expect it to be received with gratitude. The tradition suggests he was right about that. There is one more thing worth carrying from this chapter into the next. Heraclitus withdrew from politics. He refused the role he was born into. He declined the king's invitation, but he never stopped caring what happened to the communities around him. The withdrawal was not indifference. It was the decision of a man who had concluded that genuine understanding could not be achieved inside the noise of public life, but who never forgot that public life was where the consequences of understanding, or the lack of it, were most fully felt. He went into solitude to think. He left what he thought in a place where the city could find it. Whether the city was listening is another question entirely, and it leads us to the man who decided, a generation later, that the only way to answer that question was to walk into the city and find out for himself. Chapter 8. The diver Heraclitus needed. There is a story that has travelled through the history of philosophy for roughly 24 centuries, and like most stories that travel that far, it has been polished by the journey into something cleaner and more satisfying than the original situation probably was. The story goes like this. Socrates obtained a copy of the book Heraclitus had written and deposited in the Temple at Ephesus. He read it. Someone asked him what he thought of it, and Socrates said that what he could understand was excellent, and that he suspected what he could not understand was excellent too, but that understanding all of it would require a diver from Delos. We should say clearly that this anecdote comes to us through ancient tradition rather than direct documentation. Diogenes Laertius preserves a version of it, writing centuries after both men had died. The exact wording varies across sources, but the image it contains is too precise to dismiss as pure invention. A diver, not a reader, not a scholar, someone who goes down, who enters the medium that the text inhabits and moves through it under pressure, in the dark, without the ordinary orientation that surface life provides. That image understands Heraclitus in a way that a simple summary never could. Now, what follows is not history. It is a thought experiment, offered as a way of feeling the distance between two men who never met, but who were working on the same problem from opposite directions. Imagine Heraclitus on a morning in the early 5th century BCE, walking through the agora of Ephesus. The market is loud, the smell of fish and leather and wood smoke in the air. Around him, merchants arguing over prices, their voices rising and falling in the particular rhythm of people who have had the same argument every morning for 20 years. Politicians moving through the crowd with the careful warmth of men who need something from everyone and trust no one. A group of young men debating something near the fountain. Their confidence outrunning their understanding by a distance that only time will close. Heraclitus does not stop. He does not ask anyone a question. He watches the crowd the way a person watches weather, reading it, understanding it, finding in it exactly what he expected to find. Then he turns and walks back toward the quieter part of the city, and the sentence forming in his mind is not a question but a verdict. Now imagine Socrates in Athens, a generation later, walking into a scene almost identical to that one. The same noise, the same merchants, the same confident young men near the fountain. He stops. He sits down next to the young men and asks, in a tone so gentle it takes them a moment to realize what is happening, what exactly they mean by the word they just used. Not hostile, not superior, genuinely curious. In the way that a person is genuinely curious when they have spent decades discovering how much there is to find in any single word that anyone has ever used with confidence. The young men answer. Socrates asks another question. The answers begin to slow down. The confidence begins to thin. Something that looked solid an hour ago is starting to show its edges, its gaps, the places where habit has been standing in for understanding, without anyone noticing. Two men, the same diagnosis, the same city, completely different prescriptions. This is not simply a difference in personality, though it is that too. It is a difference in belief about what is actually possible for people who have not already devoted themselves to philosophy. Socrates seems to have believed that the capacity for genuine understanding was more widely distributed than its current exercise suggested, that most people, given the right kind of conversation, could be brought to recognize what they did not know, and from that recognition begin the genuine work of finding out. Heraclitus does not appear to have shared this belief. He seems to have concluded that genuine understanding required a quality of attention that most people would not choose to develop, not because they were incapable in principle, but because the world offered them so many comfortable alternatives to the discomfort of real thinking that only the rare person would make the harder choice. Who was right? This is not a question with a clean answer. Socrates' dialogue, as Plato preserved them, show genuine moments of movement in people who began a conversation convinced they knew what they were talking about and ended it less certain, more curious, more alive to the difficulty of what they had assumed was settled. That movement is real. But Socrates also died at the hands of a democratic jury that had access to his conversations every day in its marketplace, and chose by a vote of 280 to 220 to silence him permanently. Heraclitus, watching from wherever the dead watch, might have found this less surprising than Plato did. There is another connection between the two men that is less often discussed and more philosophically interesting than the diver anecdote. Both believed that the most important knowledge was self-knowledge. The Delphic instruction to know thyself was, for Socrates, the organizing principle of his entire philosophical practice. Every conversation he had was ultimately aimed at helping his interlocutor see more clearly what they actually were, rather than what they imagined themselves to be. Heraclitus wrote that he had searched himself. The fragment is brief, and its full context is unclear, but the implication is significant. The same rigorous attention he applied to rivers and fire and the tension of opposites, he applied inward. The logos that governs the external world is the same logos that governs the soul. Understanding one requires attending to the other. Self-knowledge and world knowledge are not separate projects. They are the same project approached from different directions. This is where the two men most clearly occupy the same territory, even across the generation that separated them, and the very different methods they chose for exploring it. The diver Heraclitus needed was not Socrates. The diver Heraclitus needed was anyone, in any era, willing to go down far enough to find out what is actually at the bottom. That willingness is rarer than it should be. Both men knew it. Neither of them stopped pointing toward the bottom anyway. The river kept moving through both of them, unchanged in its changing, the same in its difference, as it always was and always would be. Chapter 9. The Weeping Philosopher. At some point in the centuries after Heraclitus died, a story attached itself to his memory and refused to let go. The story said that he wept, not occasionally, in response to particular losses, the way any human being weeps, constantly, that his characteristic response to the world he lived in was tears, that the sight of human beings going about their daily lives, making their ordinary mistakes, sleeping through the Logos with their eyes open, was so painful to him that grief became his permanent condition. He became, in this tradition, the weeping philosopher, and almost always, in the same breath, he was paired with Democritus, the philosopher who laughed. The two of them became a matched set, representing the two possible responses to the spectacle of human folly. Heraclitus wept because it was tragic. Democritus laughed because it was absurd. This pairing became enormously popular in the Renaissance, when painters and poets found in it a rich source of imagery. You can find Heraclitus and Democritus together in paintings across several centuries. The weeping philosopher and the laughing philosopher, framing the human condition between them. It is a beautiful image. It is also, as an account of what Heraclitus actually wrote and actually was, considerably more invention than history. The fragments of Heraclitus that survive contain no description of him weeping. Not once. He does not describe himself as grieving for humanity. What he presents, consistently and unmistakably across the fragments, is something much closer to frustration, to the particular anger of a person who believes something important is being wasted, to the impatience of someone who can see a pattern that everyone around them is choosing not to look at. Frustration and grief are not the same thing. Grief implies loss. It implies that something present has been taken away, that the world has been diminished by an absence. Frustration implies a gap between what is and what could be. It implies the continued presence of a possibility that is not being realized. A man who has wept himself into acceptance of the human condition does not write sentences designed to shake the reader out of comfortable assumption. He does not take the care with language that Heraclitus took, the precise compression, the deliberate difficulty, the exact choice of image that will catch a prepared mind and hold it. You do not write that way if you have given up. You write that way if you believe the writing can still do something. Heraclitus was not weeping. He was insisting. Where did the weeping image come from? The most careful answer is that it developed gradually. Over the centuries between his death and the Roman era, through a process in which biographical details were added to philosophical figures to make their ideas more vivid and memorable. A philosopher whose thought was characterized by a deep sense of the gap between what human life is and what it could be, would naturally, in the biographical tradition, become a philosopher who wept at that gap. It is not a dishonest invention. Exactly. It is a translation of intellectual content into emotional image. But something is lost in the translation. What is lost is the edge, the insistence, the refusal to accept the comfortable conclusion that nothing could be done. The real Heraclitus, the one who emerges from the fragments, was still in the argument, still demanding, still writing sentences designed to make the reader uncomfortable enough to actually think. Now, consider what that quality looks like from the inside of a long life. He had watched his city exile its best man to make the rest feel more comfortable. He had watched the crowds in the agora move through the world with the confident purposefulness of people who have stopped asking whether the purpose is the right one. He had written one of the most compressed and demanding books in the history of human thought and left it in a temple. And the temple was full of people who came to pray and left without reading it. He was not weeping, but he was carrying something, the weight of a particular kind of clarity that does not get lighter with time. That weight was still there in his final years. And the story of how those years ended is one that the tradition could not resist shaping into something that fit the man it had decided he was. Whether it fits the man he actually was is a different question. Chapter 10. The Last Years. There is a story about how Heraclitus died. Before we tell it, we need to say clearly what we are dealing with. The account of his final years and death comes to us primarily through Diogenes Laertius, writing in the 3rd century of the Common Era, roughly 700 years after Heraclitus lived. Scholars, including Jonathan Barnes, who has written carefully on the pre-Socratic philosophers, treat the biographical details in sources like Diogenes Laertius with considerable caution, distinguishing between what the fragments themselves support and what the later biographical tradition added. The death story falls, by most careful assessments, closer to legend than to documented history. We tell it not because it is certainly true, but because it is certainly revealing. In the way that the stories a tradition chooses to preserve about a person are always revealing, whether or not they happened exactly as described. In his later years, according to this tradition, Heraclitus withdrew from the city entirely. He left Ephesus, left the temple where his book sat waiting for serious readers, left the agora where the merchants and politicians and priests went about the business he had spent his life finding inadequate, and went into the mountains. He lived, the tradition says, on whatever he could find there: grass, plants, whatever the landscape offered to someone who had decided that the city and everything it required was no longer worth his participation. He had always been solitary. This was solitude taken to its conclusion. Think about what that would feel like. Not the romantic version. The philosopher in the mountains, communing with nature. The actual version, sleeping on ground that is cold in ways a bed is not cold. Eating what you can find, rather than what you want. The city, a sound in the distance. Then not even that. The silence that opens up when you remove every layer of noise that you had come to mistake for the world itself. For a man who believed that most people were asleep to the actual nature of things, that silence might have felt less like deprivation and more like arrival. Then he became ill. The ancient sources describe something that sounds, in the language available to them, like a serious accumulation of fluid in the body. He came back down from the mountains and went to the doctors of Ephesus with a question that Diogenes Laertius preserves in a form that is either a genuine record or a later invention, so perfectly consistent with his character that the tradition could not resist attaching it to him. He asked the doctors whether they could turn a wet season into a dry one. The doctors did not know what he meant. He decided to treat himself. He covered himself in manure, on the theory that warmth would draw out the excess moisture the illness had produced. He lay outside in the sun, waiting for the cure to work. It did not work. He died there. According to this version, on the outskirts of the city, he had spent his life criticizing. Pause here. As a historical account, treat this with caution. The details are too perfectly ironic to sit comfortably with straightforward biography. A man who spent his life saying that most people do not understand the most basic things about the world, dying because neither the doctors nor he himself understood what his body needed. But, as a philosophical image, it is extraordinarily consistent with what Heraclitus actually wrote. He believed that opposites generate each other. Wet and dry are among the most fundamental opposites in his cosmology. He wrote that the soul is best when it is dry. An illness characterized by excess moisture, treated by a man who understood moisture and dryness as cosmic principles, using a remedy meant to restore the balance his philosophy prescribed. Whether he actually did this or not, the story the tradition preserved is the story of a man whose death was entirely of a piece with his life. He did not call for priests. He did not make conventional arrangements. He approached his dying the way he approached everything else, as a problem to be addressed through the same principles he had always used. Regardless of whether the outcome would be comfortable or comprehensible to the people watching, there is something in this that is not quite admirable and not quite absurd, and is perhaps, for exactly that reason, the most honest portrait the ancient tradition offers. A man so committed to his own way of seeing that he applied it to the last problem he would ever face, with the same uncompromising seriousness he had brought to every problem before it. His book remained in the temple. His fragments survived not because an institution preserved them, but because subsequent thinkers quoted them, argued with them, used them as touchstones for their own thinking. He had not established a school. He had not gathered students. He had written sentences that required genuine effort and left them where the serious could find them. The serious kept finding them. The fire, as he would have said, kept burning. Not the same fire, but fire, as, a process, continues in the things it has already transformed, in the forms it has moved through and left behind. The Logos does not need the individual who perceived it in order to continue operating. The river does not need the person who named it in order to keep moving. He died on the outskirts of Ephesus, and the Logos went on as it had always gone on, present in everything, available to anyone willing to look with sufficient seriousness. He would not have wanted it any other way. Chapter 11. The Fire That Kept Burning. Many serious thinkers who encountered Heraclitus had to decide what to do with him, not because he was famous in the way that later philosophers would be famous, with schools and students and institutional legacies. He had none of those things, but because the ideas in the fragments were alive in a way that made them impossible to simply set aside, they kept pressing against the assumptions of subsequent thought, forcing the people who encountered them to either engage or deliberately look away. Deliberately looking away from Heraclitus is harder than it sounds. The things he was pointing at do not go away just because you have decided not to look at them. So let us trace what actually happened, not the overclaimed version in which Heraclitus secretly invented everything that came after him, the honest version, which is more interesting because it shows how a genuinely difficult idea moves through time, changing as it moves, being used in ways its originator might not have recognized, losing something at each translation and gaining something too. The first significant inheritors were the Stoics. Stoicism developed in Athens beginning around 300 BCE, roughly 2 centuries after Heraclitus. The founder, Zeno of Citium, and his successors built one of the most influential philosophical schools the ancient world produced, one whose ideas about ethics, reason, and the good life reached into Roman culture through figures like Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, and have continued to find readers in every century since. The Stoics took from Heraclitus 2 things in particular: the concept of the Logos as the rational principle governing the universe, and the image of fire as the primary substance of reality. They developed both in directions that were more systematic and more practically oriented than Heraclitus had been. Whether Heraclitus would have recognized these developments as faithful extensions of his ideas or as distortions of them is a question the historical record cannot answer. What we can say is that the Stoics treated him as a genuine predecessor, cited him seriously, and built real philosophical architecture on foundations he had laid. From the Stoics, these ideas travelled further than Heraclitus could have imagined. The Gospel of John opens with a sentence that has been read and translated and argued about for roughly 2,000 years. In the beginning was the Logos. The choice of Logos, rather than any of the other Greek words available for word or speech or reason, was not arbitrary. It drew on a tradition of thinking about Logos as the rational structure of reality, a tradition that ran from Heraclitus through the Stoics and into the philosophical vocabulary that the authors of the New Testament were working within. We are not saying that Heraclitus invented Christian theology. We are saying something more careful. The concept he developed became part of the shared intellectual vocabulary of the ancient Mediterranean world in ways that subsequent thinkers drew on. Sometimes consciously, sometimes not. That is a traceable historical connection, not a claim about origins or intentions. Now, stop for a moment, because before we move to the modern era, it is worth sitting with what has just been said. A man who wrote 1 book and put it in a temple, who gathered no students, who built no institution, whose fragments survived only because other people found them impossible to ignore, had by this point already shaped one of the most influential philosophical schools in history, and left a trace in the opening line of one of the most widely read texts in human civilization. He was not trying to do any of this. He was trying to tell the truth about the river. The truth, it turned out, had legs. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the German philosopher writing in the early 19th century of the Common Era, placed contradiction and its resolution at the centre of his account of how reality develops over time. In his lectures on the history of philosophy, Hegel wrote with considerable enthusiasm about Heraclitus, in the context of tracing the development of dialectical thinking in Western thought, and stated that there is no proposition of Heraclitus which he had not adopted in his logic. Historians of philosophy debate how literally to take this claim, and Hegel's system differs from Heraclitus in important ways, particularly in its progressive historical orientation. which Heraclitus did not share. But the engagement was genuine. The context was scholarly acknowledgement rather than casual praise, and the acknowledgement was direct. Friedrich Nietzsche, writing in the latter half of the 19th century, loved Heraclitus, not in the careful scholarly way of someone cataloguing influences, in the way that a person loves a thinker who seems to have seen something true that everyone else has been covering up. He called him the most just of men. He said that in Heraclitus, the problem of becoming is finally given its proper weight. What Nietzsche found in Heraclitus was a vision of reality that did not flinch from the implications of constant change. He also, characteristically, overstated the connection in ways that said as much about Nietzsche as about Heraclitus. Heraclitus believed in the Logos as a governing rational principle, which is precisely the kind of underlying order that Nietzsche's mature philosophy was arguing against. But Nietzsche read him hungrily and selectively, and the reading produced some of the most vivid prose about Heraclitus that any subsequent thinker has written. Even a partial and enthusiastic reading that brings a difficult thinker back to the attention of a new generation is a form of keeping the fire burning. Now we need to address the question of modern physics honestly, because it comes up every time Heraclitus is discussed for a contemporary audience. There is a version of his story that presents him as having somehow anticipated modern physics, specifically the physics of continuous change and process that emerged in the 20th century. What we can say honestly is this: Heraclitus was pointing at something real when he insisted that physical reality is better understood as process than as a collection of stable objects. The river is not a thing. It is a process. This intuition is genuinely consistent with some of the ways that 20th century physics came to describe reality at certain scales. But consistency is not prediction. Heraclitus did not have access to the mathematics, the experimental methods, or the specific problems that produced modern physics. To say more than this would be to say something the evidence does not support, and saying things the evidence does not support is exactly the failure that Heraclitus spent his life criticizing in others. The subsequent 25 centuries have not made the question disappear. They have only made it more precise. Let us end where we should end, not with influence, not with legacy, with you. In this moment, in whatever room you are lying in, with whatever the day left behind still settling somewhere in the body, you have spent this night moving through the life and thought of a man who believed that the world has a structure, that the structure is available to anyone willing to attend to it, and that most people, most of the time, are choosing not to. He believed this not out of despair, but out of a clear-eyed assessment of what he observed, combined with a stubborn insistence that the observation did not have to be permanent. The Logos is common. It belongs to all of us. The only thing required to access it is the quality of attention that most of us spend most of our lives finding ways to avoid. Consider what you attended to today, not what you accomplished, not what you produced, not what you managed to get through, what you actually noticed, the moment when the light changed in a way that was different from yesterday, the pause in a conversation that said more than the words on either side of it, the thing you almost looked at carefully and then did not, because the day was moving and there were other things to do. Those almost moments are the river. They are always there. They do not wait for you to be ready. They move whether you are watching or not. Heraclitus watched. He watched more carefully and for longer than almost anyone else was willing to. And what he left behind was not a system, not a school, not a set of doctrines to be memorized and recited. What he left behind was a quality of attention, compressed into fewer than 150 sentences, placed in a temple, and left for whoever was serious enough to find it. You found it tonight, or some part of it found you. The fire keeps burning. The river keeps moving. The opposites keep generating each other, and the tension between them keeps producing the world. You will wake up tomorrow as a person who has been changed by tonight. Even if the change is too small to measure, the you who settled in to hear the story of a man who refused to explain himself is not quite the same as the you who will open your eyes in a few hours and begin asking what he meant. That gap, small as it is the river moving? He noticed more than most people were willing to notice. That was his gift and his burden and his permanent, unresolvable argument with the world he lived in, which is also, in every way that matters, the world we are living in still. The fire does not go out. It simply moves. It is in the questions you are carrying when you open your eyes in the morning. It was there before you found them. It will be there after you are gone. That is what he was trying to tell you. In a book he put in a temple, written in sentences that required a diver to understand, left for whoever was serious enough to go down and find out what was at the bottom. You went down tonight. What you found there is yours now. Good night. The river is still moving.